Welcome to spvessel channel. This video consists of 3 parts. In the first part, I will tell you about several changes on my channel and review all resources that you can get using SpaceVIL framework. In the second part, I will move on to the main topic of this video. I will introduce a new interface, OpenGL layer, tell you how to work with it and what you should pay attention to. In the end of the second part, I will do some conclusions about SpaceVIL and OpenGL layer. All this will be accompanied by a rather simple example. The basis of the example is taken from the internet and dropped in SpaceVIL technology. Link to the example in the description. In the third part of the video, I will present the next video and tell you about how I plan to develop my channel. Well, let's get started! Resources. Okay, we have videos, examples on GitHub repository, website and documentation. First of all, the first 3 videos are no longer relevant, and you cannot count on them. That's why I mark them as deprecated. Now let's take a look at the new example structures of GitHub repository. Repository had 3 directories: complex, quick templates and tutorials. In complex, I will be posting the source code for demo programs. From these examples you can see how to use SpaceVIL in practice. In the complex directory there is a division into apps and demos. Apps directory contains useful and complete applications based on SpaceVIL. Demos directory contains applications for demonstrating SpaceVIL complex features, but these examples do not do any useful work. In the quick templates I will be posting small common examples of using SpaceVIL aspects. At the moment there is only an example of SpaceVIL initialization and a simple window template. Tutorials directory will contain more complex and useful examples of using SpaceVIL features and SpaceVIL elements. For now, there are examples of using combo box with its styling, using effects, using OpenGL in SpaceVIL environment, example of style creation and tooltip example. And now we have a new decent documentation that covers all classes of the framework. You can read documentation via links on spvessel website or download documentation for using in your IDE. Okay, let's go to the main topic of this video. To provide access to OpenGL technology in SpaceVIL, I developed the OpenGL layer interface. And now I will show you how to use it. I must say right away that there is nothing complicated here, but some things will be clear only to developers familiar with OpenGL technology. I prepared an example and posted it in the repository, so you can familiarize yourself. I will show how OpenGL layer works both in C# and Java. Let's start with C#. The main steps for using OpenGL in SpaceVIL are simple. Find and choose any suitable OpenGL wrapper for .NET or JVM and connect it to your project. Create new class and extend it from prototype or primitive. Implement OpenGL layer and optionally implement interface draggable and or interface movable. Write a rendering algorithm. That's all. You do not need to do anything else. Now let's go through all steps. For C# example I choose #GL and connected it to my example. Before namespace using, I passed link to the library. I created a new class and extended it from prototype and implemented OpenGL layer and draggable. I wrote rendering algorithm of cube with lighting. And here is the result. Let's talk about the implementation in more detail. After the second step, we have the basis of our OpenGL element. Let's see what OpenGL layer interface wants from us. We do not need to call this method manually, just describe them. The initialize method is needed to initialize OpenGL resources, such as object vertices and shader programs. Here you can see that I configured some OpenGL attributes and compiled 3 shader programs for cube rendering, lighting, and the last for texture rendering. I create a cube vertex buffer, set up view and projection matrices. Nothing complicated, but if you are interested in, you can go to the tutorial via link in the description. Well, I simplified this example even more and added something else for testing, but more on that later. The isInitialized method should return true if the initialize method has already been called and the resources are ready to be used. I created a boolean variable and returned it in this method. Above it, at the end of the initialize method, I set it to true. In the draw method, you need to describe the rendering algorithm itself, and here is what I did. I will tell you very simply, skipping many details, since the purpose of this video is not to teach how to work with OpenGL. Also, this example does not show how to use the OpenGL resources in the right way. For example, in this case it is very expensive to create and delete additional FBO at each iteration of the draw call, but for such example this approach is much easier to implement. By the way, you can remove the use of additional FBO at all. But with its help I can easily test the rendering of textures. Okay, I create an additional frame buffer object for rendering into it, and I will render the result as a texture to the default frame buffer. Inside getTexturedFBO method I create second FBO, configure it, and bind texture to the FBO. Then I set up the viewport according to the size of the element and clear color buffer and depth buffer. After that comes code block for rendering cube with lighting. Next I unbind additional frame buffer and restore viewport of the element. In the end I simply draw the resulting texture and clean up the resources used. Now some clarifications. In fact, you need to be very careful when working with the OpenGL layer interface. It is important to remember that SpaceVIL itself is based on OpenGL technology, so there are things that can be used incorrectly and eventually break the entire rendering. The simplest example is to call method to clear color buffer. At each iteration of the rendering, SpaceVIL takes care of much common things. You just need to focus on the algorithm for rendering what you want. By the way, you may notice that I use renderServing class. This class is a small addition to the OpenGL interface. Using it, you can restore OpenGL settings if you change them and manage viewport of OpenGL elements. And we have only the last interface method that we need to implement. In the free method, we describe the removal of all used OpenGL resources. This method is called when OpenGL layer element is deleted. Here I delete the shader programs and other OpenGL resources. I also set the initialization flag to false. That's all. For a complete picture of what is happening, I will tell you how SpaceVIL uses OpenGL layer. Obviously, SpaceVIL has its own rendering loop. At each iteration of the loop, if SpaceVIL encounters an object of type of OpenGL layer, it calls initialize method if this object is not yet initialized. Sets the viewport for this object according to its position and size, calls draw method, restores initial viewport. This is how SpaceVIL renders objects of OpenGL layer type. Since in this example the element is an implementation of prototype, there is nothing stopping you from adding other elements to it, for example buttons and slider. Thus, it is possible to greatly simplify the creation of complex element based on OpenGL layer For example, creating a user interface for a game or creating a user interface for 3D visualization of an object like here. Interaction with an element occurs trivially, through inputs events. All this in the example and can be studied. Let's take a look into Java example. The basic steps for using interface OpenGL layer are the same, but in some cases even easier. Find and choose any suitable OpenGL wrapper and connect it to your project. Here in this place everything is simple. SpaceVIL requires the LWJGL library and it can also be used as an OpenGL wrapper. LWJGL in use is almost the same as a standard OpenGL library. Well, back to the step for using interface OpenGL layer. Create new class and extend it from prototype or primitive. Implement interface OpenGL layer and optionally implement interface draggable and or interface movable. Write a rendering algorithm. Now, if you look at the example itself, it's no different from the version for C#. I create shader programs and resources. Use additional FBO, draw a cube and delete resources. The result, as you see, is identical. And now I will express some thoughts about feature of using OpenGL and SpaceVIL. I think it turned out well. For users of purely OpenGL, this will be a very convenient solution. No need to write a lot of boilerplate code. SpaceVIL takes care of this. Additionally, the developer gets all the features of SpaceVIL. You can easily create the UI on top of the interface OpenGL layer elements and focus on the implementation of renderings what you need. Maybe you have a question. For example, since SpaceVIL uses OpenGL, then why do you need to look for third-party wrappers, because such a wrapper is already built into SpaceVIL? Well, the answer is quite simple. In fact, the built-in wrapper covers no more than 20% of the functions and content of OpenGL, and I'm not ready to write a full-fledged wrapper and keep it relevant. Since SpaceVIL is primarily a framework for building cross-platform GUI applications. Therefore, use third-party wrappers. Some of you probably have wrappers that you are used to, for example the same SharpGL, and in combination with SpaceVIL you will get a powerful system for implementing your ideas. Now let's move on to the final part of the video. I'm going to release a series of lessons on SpaceVIL from the very beginning. I will tell you in detail about most aspects. Sometimes lessons will be interrupted by videos in the style of new features in the SpaceVIL environment. Sometimes I will talk about how I use SpaceVIL for my personal purposes. Just the next video will be about it. I will talk about my periodic hobby, the Advanced Gamepad program. And on this I say goodbye to you. I hope the video was interesting. Subscribe to the channel, leave comments. It greatly motivates me to continue to improve SpaceVIL. Thanks for watching and good luck!